Okay, I wanted to make this video for my family, for my brothers, my cousins, my mom, my dad, my aunts, my uncles, anyone that might find this interesting. But I do think it's an interesting enough story that I thought people who are not in my family may also enjoy it as well. Either way, I want to post this on YouTube so that it's available and it's accessible so that anyone who wants to watch can, but certainly it makes it easy for family and friends to watch this video and then do their own research. The things I'm going to say are certainly not 100% certain. I have no actual factual data that I can definitively prove anything I'm going to say. It's more just a series of unusual circumstances, and let's call it a rabbit hole, with clues that I've kind of been following for a while. And I did come by way of some new information. So I thought it might be fruitful to kind of compile all of this into a video, hopefully for your enjoyment. So I apologize in advance if this is long, but it has been a bit of a long process coming to some of these conclusions. So I thought it might be beneficial to sort of walk everyone through the whole process to see why I arrived at some of the conclusions that I have arrived at. I think the best place to begin would be in the beginning. When I was growing up as a kid, there was sort of a family rumor, I guess you could say. Not even a rumor, just a family story. It was a humorous one. And that was that my grandparents had a family of 5 boys, which is true. It was all same-sex children. And it's because Grandpa was there when they tested the atom bomb. The story goes that when Grandpa was in the war, he served in the Navy. He was present when the U.S. government tested the atomic weapons, the atom bomb. And at least according to his account of this, people who were at this event were exposed to radiation. And as a result of this, they tended to have single-sex children. And that's why he had 5 boys. It's kind of like a family folklore, family legend, whatever. The second story about my grandfather was that he was actually in training to be a part of the Underwater Demolition Team, okay? UDT. This was an organization that developed in World War II in response to some of the global threats and as an early form of an emerging trend that we would see in all the armed forces, which is to move people, certain people, skilled people, out of a standard service position into something more specialized. Now, people who know about this know that the Underwater Demolition Team eventually became the Navy SEALs. So it was sort of like the precursor to the SEALs. Well, this was always kind of like a cool story, especially in a family full of boys, that Grandpa was like a Navy SEAL. Well, truthfully, he wasn't a Navy SEAL, not only because the Underwater Demolition Team wasn't officially SEALs, that label wouldn't come till later. But he didn't make the cut, I guess, would be the way to say this. And his story was he blew out his ear, during an exercise. And as a result of that, he was not allowed to continue with his training. Now, as a kid or a young man, you don't really know the truth. So maybe you take your grandfather at his words. Maybe you're skeptical and you say, was that really it, Grandpa? Or did you just not cut the mustard? You know what I mean? And of course, you never know. You never know what the real story is. But as I got older, my family moved from down south up north to Michigan, where my grandparents lived. And at the time, we were living in a place where my grandparents were often present. They lived nearby, and they would frequently spend time at our house. And I got to spend a lot of time with my grandfather. And I'm not naturally sort of quizzical person. I ask a lot of questions. And I'm also the kind of person that when someone tells me something that doesn't line up, I'm kind of like, wait, what? Like, what? And I need, it's not because I don't believe them, and it's not because I don't care. It's just because I have to make sense of it in my own head. And if I can't make sense of something in my own head, I just sort of keep asking. It's probably annoying. It can be probably an obnoxious personality characteristic, but I think it probably has served me in some cases of life. Either way, and I haven't really put this all together until recently, which is why I'm kind of putting this video together. Around the age of 16 or 17, around that age, 15, 16, 17, this is when my grandfather was around more. And I used to spend time with him. I used to talk with him, and I used to ask him a lot of questions. Some of these things I would come up would be his war stories, and I would ask him questions, and he would kind of give me information, but it was always also kind of clouded and a sort of shroud of mystery. He didn't seem to want to be very forthcoming with information, which was weird as well. But I remember around this time, he received an envelope in the mail from the federal government, and it was about declassified information regarding the atomic weapons testing. And come to find out, apparently, due to whatever laws had been in place, freedom of information, the material about this particular event was released to the public. And my grandfather, again, apparently had already requested in advance information regarding these events. So he received this envelope at our house. He had it. And true to form of typical sort of military information, it was not helpful at all. I mean, it gave some very, very specific like times and dates and things like that, but it didn't really give much more than that. But I remember actually opening it up and seeing it with my grandfather and him kind of telling me about it. This was, when they did the atom bomb testing. And it at least confirmed that what he was saying was correct. He wasn't making the story up. It was real. And that event is known now as Operation Crossroads. And it was a true classified military event. I'm going to pull some slides up throughout this talk because I think it may be helpful. So hold on just a minute here, and I'm going to pull up a slide on Operation Crossroads so I can give you a little bit of information about it. Okay, so if you just do a simple search of Operation Crossroads, you can find this information out there on the internet. But you can see it was a pair of nuclear tests conducted by the United States at Bikini Atoll in the mid of 1946. They were the first of two tests done throughout these dates, and it was to test the nuclear weapons and how they would, essentially how the environment would respond to being exposed to these types of destructive bombs. Now, from this slide, if you read down here at the bottom, it says that in 1996, in 1997, this classified event was declassified and made known to the public. This is relevant because this is when my grandfather would have received the envelope from the federal government, but it's also when I believe he became a little bit more comfortable giving some details about his actual service time. So in short, Operation Crossroads was a real event. It was classified up until 1996 and 97, which makes sense because this was around the time when I was talking with my grandfather. And now in hindsight, I think I realize, having talked to other family members, that I think it just was sort of an opportune or inopportune, I don't know how you want to describe it, moment, because I think once my grandfather realized that a lot of this information had been sort of declassified, made public, he became a little bit more open to talking about his experiences. And it seems like as I asked him certain questions, he gave me maybe more information, although still very small, infinitesimally small amounts of information, because he was always very tight-lipped about his military service. But it seems like I got maybe a little bit of more things from him than maybe some of the other family members. Much of this, to me, had been lost or forgotten. It just was conversations I had with my grandfather, and I kind of filed them away in my brain. Never thought much about him. All I knew is that my grandfather tried out or was selected to try out for this underwater demolition team. He didn't make it, apparently because of some type of ear injury. And then he was restationed on a destroyer. And one of the tasks that this destroyer was left to deal with was they were stationed out in the ocean where they were doing these tests of the atomic weapons, which was a real event, and my grandfather was there. And that's about it. Other than that, he was a gunnery sergeant, I think, according to his officially documented paperwork, which I shout out to my cousin Josh. He did retrieve some of that information from our request from the Freedom of Information Act. And it did say that I think he worked in the boiler room, which sounds like what my grandfather said. So kind of an entry-level, Navy officer on a destroyer. So, not terribly interesting, seemingly. However, again, based off conversations I had had with him, there seemed like there was something more there, stories that were weird that didn't kind of line up with this. And I couldn't ever really make sense of it, but I didn't have any reason to think differently. Unfortunately, my grandfather's now passed away, and my grandmother's passed away as well, so I don't really have anyone I could actually ask these questions to, so I'm going just off my own speculation and research. But the way that this all came about was not through intentionality. I didn't go out seeking this. In fact, I hadn't thought about it in years. But as a person who's just a general person of interest, I have a hobbyist, and I'm interested in a lot of topics. I came across a author by the name of Annie Jacobsen. So I'm going to briefly pause and tell you a little bit about Annie Jacobsen. So this is a photo of Annie Jacobsen. She's a pretty renowned, well-known investigative journalist. She does a lot of work with top secret operatives and covers a lot of topics that have to do with Secret Service and high-level governmental things. She's got podcasts out there. She's written several books. But the book I mainly want to talk about is this one. So after reading some of her other works, I came across this book, which is called Surprise, Vanish, Kill. And it actually offers a history of the early CIA. So I chose the book just because of her as an author, and I had enjoyed her other work, and that was really my only interest initially. Jacobsen's primary point of contact is actually an old CIA operative by the name of Billy Waugh. He's going to be a key point of discussion, so I just wanted to show you this photo of his Wikipedia page, which you can go look up and learn more about him if you don't feel like reading the entire book. So I don't exactly remember what got me into reading Jacobsen's work. I think I heard her on a podcast or something. It seemed interesting. I believe the first book I read of hers was Operation Paperclip, which is a fascinating story. And I really enjoyed her writing, great writing, really interesting stuff in this area. And so I started reading the book, Surprise, Kill, Vanish. And I should say I was listening to it on Audible because I tend to listen to books on audio when I'm driving around for work. And as I'm listening to the story, I'm just driving around, and Billy Waugh is essentially telling his more or less autobiographical account of his own start and emergence into what becomes America's Secret Service operations. And Waugh is a perfect example of this, and I think that's probably why Jacobsen uses him, because he was sort of there at its inception. And he was there when the government started this sort of fly-by-night operation that they later termed the Office of Strategic Services, okay, OSS. And the OSS would eventually evolve over time. It had like an intermediate title. It was like a different thing. I think it was like the Bureau of Investigative Strategies or something. I don't know. I don't remember that one. But then it eventually became the CIA. And Waugh became a lifer. He started in, after World War II, and then moved forward. And he ended up retiring as a lifetime sort of special operative. He's one of the most celebrated operatives in the history of the United States Armed Forces. In fact, he's one of the first people to ever do a halo jump. So if you've ever played the game Halo, a video game, that's where that comes from. Diving out of these helicopters at a very high altitude, and then sort of only opening your chute till you get very close to land. And he was one of the people who pioneered that. So just very important, all the way from the Vietnam War or the Korean War, Vietnam War, and even up and through the Middle East and even the War on Terror. Instrumental roles even in tracking the Taliban and Osama bin Laden much later in his life. Fascinating story. Worth reading the book just to learn about him as a real life person. But what's interesting to me about Billy Waugh is he started to tell the story in this book about his sort of being placed in this branch, the sort of secret branch of the government known as the Office of Strategic Services. And the way Waugh tells the story was fascinating, not only because it's just an interesting story, but as I was listening to him, things he was saying started to resonate in weird ways with me that correlated to my grandfather's story. And it started with one kind of like commonality, which is like, okay, you know, whatever. But then more and more things started to kind of fall into place. So let me rewind and go back to my grandfather's story. Okay, so my grandfather was a member of the or enrolled in the Navy. Okay, and this is in the early to mid 40s. Okay, probably around 1945, I think, if my estimations are correct. And he shows aptitude, so he's selected amongst some of these other naval officers to participate in this training in the underwater demolition team. And this is the story he tells. And then he tells a story that during one of these exercises, he gets an ear injury. He blows out his eardrum or something. And as a result of that, he can no longer dive and he's restationed. And that's when he ends up being placed overseas in the ocean for these atomic weapons tests that become a classified operation known as Operation Crossroads. Okay. Now, when I was a kid, I'd asked my grandfather about this because I was wondering, like, why didn't why didn't you make it into the, the underwater demolition team? Like, what was it that you didn't get you in? And he's like, well, it's because of this ear thing. And I'm like, well, what did you do when you went overseas? This is my quizzical mind asking questions. Like, well, I would have to go in and I'd have to do these dives in the water and have to retrieve stuff after these tests were done. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second. Like, you're removed from the underwater demolition team because of your ears. Why would they assign you to do dive work? It didn't make sense to me, so I kind of asked just what I thought was an obvious question. Presumably, maybe, when you get into these higher level, high-performing special forces and things like this, maybe the expectation is higher. So I thought, well, maybe it was just that, he still was doing diving because he had some diving background, but he wasn't up to speed to do, the level of diving that you needed to do to be in sort of these elite company. But then my grandfather said something interesting. He said, oh, well, I didn't really because I asked him, like, did you blow out your ear? Did it hurt? Would that, I'm asking like the kind of questions I think would be like a normal question. He's like, well, no, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with my ear. And I'm like, what? He's like, well, there wasn't really anything wrong with my ear. I'm like, well, I thought that's why you weren't in underwater demolition. He's like, well, they just said that because they needed to move me somewhere. And I was like, what? He's like, they wanted to move me somewhere else. And I said, I'm like, okay, wait. So you're removed from the underwater demolition team. You're doing the training. You're removed from the underwater demolition team because they wanted to move you somewhere else. And I'm like, where did they move you? He's like, well, that's when I went to the test sites for these atomic weapons. And I was like, well, why did they do that? Like that? And he's like, I don't know. He says, I didn't ask questions. Back then, in that situation, this is the 1945, in the middle of a war, you just do what you're told. So he said, so I did. Well, anyways, what Billy Waugh says is that he actually was in the Army. He himself showed aptitude. He was selected to join the 184th Airborne, which was an elite fighting force in the Army. These are the paratroopers who would do halo jumps and things. Well, not really halo jumps yet, but they would do the parajumping into enemy territories. They were like the underwater demolition team, kind of the elite guys that were in the Army or Navy that were selected to do these slightly more difficult sort of special operations. And what Waugh says is that he showed such aptitude at his tasks in the 104th Airborne that eventually he was approached by some people in the government. And basically they told him that they needed him to do some special tasks that only certain people would be capable of doing. And he said at that point he agreed to do what they asked. They removed him from the 184th Airborne. They reduced his status to an entry-level status of whatever that would be. but they positioned him to do these, essentially what we would now refer to as special operations. Most of this was all cloak and dagger, as Weil reports, and it was working with a very small minority of people. It's like only the people in this little backdoor office kind of knew what was going on. And what this was, as Weil points out in this book, is the early infantile stages of what would become the CIA and the Secret Service operations of the federal government. The United States government was kind of taking, let's say, taking the lead of the British government, who had already developed a Secret Service program that had shown success, and they realized they needed to do something like this, but it was sort of unorganized and random. And the way that Waugh says it is they would start to give these guys, they would select these guys to do these things, and they would remove them from wherever they were, and they were usually in a more elite status, like a airborne or a underwater demolition team, but they would use an excuse to get them out of that area. And the one that he specifically cited in the book was, they would say, oh, he's got ear problems. He blew out his ear. And that's actually the one they used for Waugh. So they took him out of the airborne and they started giving this. But what that was this group of people ended up being the Office for Strategic Services, the OSS. Waugh says this was a common thing that they would do. And I'm hearing this, I'm going, well, that's weird, because that's actually exactly what happened to my grandfather. He was in the underwater demolition team. He never completed it, the training, but he was removed for an ear problem. That was what was reported. But later in life, as I was older and I asked him more about it, he confessed to me that he never had an ear problem and that he was only moved because the government wanted him to take on this other task where he would go into a different position, still under a normal sort of entry-level position in the Navy, but to do these specialized tasks through the back door of the Office of Strategic Services. Maybe. I wondered, that's weird. It's eerily similar to Waugh's story. Like, it almost sounds the same, just the Navy version versus the Army version. You put them side by side. But I thought, well, it's probably just circumstantial. I mean, when you're diving, you certainly could blow out your ear. When you're parasailing or paradiving, whatever you want to call it, I don't know the proper terms, you could certainly blow out your ear. But just because that was it. But it was the fact that my grandfather later admitted, again, after this was all sort of released, that he never had an ear injury. That was peculiar. So I kind of filed that away. I'm like, oh, that's weird, whatever. And I didn't think much of it. But what really got me was as Waugh continued to tell his story. He said that after the war was over and he got out, he and many of these other guys who were in the early phases of what would become the Office of Strategic Services and eventually the CIA were offered governmental jobs where they would go back home after the war and they'd be assigned to a governmental job. The governmental job that he was assigned to, and he said many guys were assigned to, were the United States Postal Service. My grandfather, after he got out of the war, got a job with the United States Postal Service. And Waugh says that they did that intentionally to keep track on these people, to keep tabs on them. And he said he worked there for some time, just at his local, old hometown postal service, until one day, people from the government showed up at his job and basically like, you're Billy Waugh, we need you to go back in. And they explained what they needed him to do. And he agreed to move forward with their request. And at that point in time, he joined in as a full-timer and then eventually served his entire, basically, career serving under these Secret Service operations. Started as OSS, eventually became CIA, so on and so forth. Now, here's what's peculiar about this from my grandfather's standpoint. Not only was he a postman, again, around the same time as I was a little bit older and I was prying more questions, he told me that he was assigned there. And it was actually my grandmother who told me once, in kind of a fleeting moment, she said, well, the government came back for Grandpa. And I said, what? And she's like, yeah, well, I don't know. One day he was at work, working at the post office, and people from the government showed up at his job. Even at that age, I thought that's peculiar. Like, wait, what? Why is the government coming for Grandpa? He's like the mailroom or whatever. She's like, well, they wanted him to go back in the military. And he came home and he told me, and I'm like, no, because we had kids. And so he went back and he told me, he's like, no, I can't do it. I've got kids and yada, yada, yada. And so they said, okay. And then I said, what happened? He said, well, then he stopped working at the post office and he started, doing other stuff. He ended up he sold cars for a while, and then he ended up becoming actually a pastor. He was a minister. And that's what he retired doing and was remembered for. And I had forgotten about that story because it just was a weird story that was sort of filed back in my brain. But once I heard the story from Billy Waugh, I was like, oh my word. This is the exact same thing that happened to my grandfather. He was assigned to the post office. He claimed he got the job through the government after the war. And he claimed, and my grandmother claimed, that the government came looking for him years later to try to get him to come back in. And at that point in time, I go, wait a second. And then I started thinking back to these stories that my grandfather would tell me. And he told me a lot of weird stories. I'll give you two by way of example. One of the things he told me was that he was tasked with going and getting guys and bringing them back. I didn't know what that meant. I thought, like, what is he talking about? Like, when guys are on leave, they go out, they go to the bars, they go to the strip clubs or the whorehouses or whatever, and they get too wasted and drunk, and Grandpa's the guy that's dragging them back home. And I remember asking him a couple questions, like, well, why, oh, so I thought, like military police or something? Like, that was your job? He's like, no. And I'm like, what? Well, like, why did they send you? And he's like, because I was the guy who could get them back. Okay, so I didn't know what to do with that. Like, that's a weird thing to say. And again, he wasn't real forthcoming with information. But another story he told me once, we were out working in the shed, doing stuff, and he was telling me the story. He's like, when I was in the military, one of the things I learned, he's like, if you ever need to do something, we got to go somewhere, and you don't want people asking questions. He's like, here's what you do. And he said, I would do this, and I would go get a bag of tools somewhere, or grab a couple tools and a rag, and I would just walk around and I'd act like I was angry and just frustrated. I'd be cleaning tools, like I was stressed out. He said, I found that if you did that, no one asked you questions and you could kind of go wherever you wanted to go. And I was like, okay. That's a weird thing to kind of say. I'm like, what are you doing, Grandpa? I'm thinking, like, is he just trying to get out of his, like, work duty? Like, he doesn't want to, like, and maybe that was it. I don't know. I mean, I perceive this as, like, Grandpa's the guy who brings back the drunk guys after they have too many beers, and Grandpa's the guy who tries to get out of work detail by pretending like he's busy so people leave him alone. But all this other stuff started to kind of coalesce and make me have another thought about this. I'm like, as I think more about this matches really closely to Billy Waugh's story. Now, I have no way of definitively proving this per se. I had mentioned a lot of this information to family members to just see, hey, did you know anything about this? Did Grandpa ever give you stories about this stuff? And come to find out, it sounds like he didn't talk to most people about a lot of this stuff. I think I asked a lot of questions. I was also watching a lot of James Bond movies at this time. This is like in the 90s when, like, TBS would have their, like, seasonal James Bond marathons, and I'd gotten really into the old Connery films like Thunderball and Dr. No. And so I don't know. And again, I think the fact that the Freedom of Information Act had allowed it so that a lot of this information was made public, he seemed to be more willing to talk in some detail about this. But he didn't himself seem to always know the answer to the questions. Now, one of the things that Billy Waugh has said in this book by Jacobson is that even he early on didn't know. He would just be told to go somewhere and to do a task, and he would just do it. He didn't really know. Again, there were no titles, there were no nothing, but he said if you showed aptitude and you got the task done, they would keep giving you more tasks. And that story says sort of how it started. It was a very infantile stage of this sort of Secret Service development. And that sounded very much like the things my grandfather said. Like, he didn't really know why he was being moved around. He was never really given answers, but people who had power over him would basically just come and tell him he had to go do things. And he said, I just did it. I just did whatever they told me to do. And so it sort of matched up. So I didn't have any definitive answers. I will say this. When I reached out to family members about it, they were curious and found it interesting as well. So two things happened. My cousin, Gary, actually reached out to the Underwater Demolition Team, or Frogman Museum, which is actually in South Florida, and just said, hey, listen, my grandfather used to say he was part of this. Do you guys have any documentation? Do you have any records? And they looked at him and they said, no, as far as our records, he was never part of the Underwater Demolition Team. There's no records of this. So then I'm like, well, okay, is grandpa just making this all up? I don't know. But then, of course, I remembered to be fair, he never was actually a member of the underwater demolition team, right? He ended his training because of an ear injury before he was officially placed, not unlike how Waugh was removed before he was in the 184th Airborne. Actually, I'm not sure. He may have served a few, I don't know the exact details of Waugh. I might be wrong on that. I may be misquoting him. But either way, he was removed from the Airborne. So I'm like, so it could be that he just, isn't in the books because he never officially served as a member of the underwater demolition team, which sort of matches his story. The other thing was, well, what about this classified mission, this Operation Crossroads? Well, you can Google it, and I'll show you a slide here. So let me pause here and just kind of show you this about the Operation Crossroads. So here's the slide I showed you earlier. So again, you can go look this up on your own, but what this does tell us, besides that this was a real operation, is that there actually was a very heavy naval presence there. There was a ton of ships there, and it wasn't as secretive as you may think. So who knows what the truth is? But the other thing I want to show you is this. This is going to be important in a minute, but this is information about the underwater demolition team that he claimed to be a part of. What we learn here is that in 1942, this is when the Army and Navy started to work to form these groups, and the first training took place in Little Creek, Virginia. Okay, so that would have been the first group of people participating in the underwater demolition crew, and it would have been in 1942 in Little Creek, Virginia. You can see that right there on that slide. So what can be gathered from this is it was a classified operation, but there's a lot of people involved. There's a very heavy naval presence there. So again, going back to the original story, if he was just a gunnery sergeant, working in the boiler room of a destroyer, it could be that he was there. There were certainly many of them there. It doesn't necessarily make it a special ops mission. But when I asked him what he had to do, he told me the story about these retrievals, which doesn't seem to match the normal story. And again, doesn't fit with his story about his ear not being able to dive. But who knows, right? It's all a mystery. But today I started looking more into the OSS. I couldn't remember the name of the organization. Annie Jacobsen was recently doing some podcast. I was listening to her again because she's releasing another book, by the way, on the atomic bomb. Kind of curiously enough. And so I wanted to hear what she had to say. And it reminded me of all the stuff that I haven't really touched base on in a while. And so I got online and I was kind of looking at what was the name of that organization that I thought maybe Grandpa was a part of that was like pre-CIA. And I found this link and somehow, I don't know how I missed this before, how I found it. The internet's crazy. But I found this link in this OSS webpage, and it actually stated how a lot of this information has since been released and is available online. They actually gave me a link to a governmental page where you can actually look at these old documents. And I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. So I clicked the link and I went to the page and I'm like, let me search my grandfather's name. So I did, and I actually did 2 searches. So I want to pause here and I want to show you what I found. Okay, so what I found was what they refer to apparently in the Navy as muster rolls, which are essentially the attendance sheets, for lack of a better term, that was kept throughout the war. When I Googled my grandfather's name, which you can see at the top there, one of the first things that came up was this amphibious training that he received. But there was more. Check this one out. This is another amphibious training that he's listed as being at, and it's the training that was at Little Creek, Virginia, which would have been the initial first training of the underwater demolition team, which would have made him one of the original members of this team, at least in terms of training. Furthermore, it does establish that my grandfather was there. He did take these trainings. He wasn't making the stories up. They were real. And look, there's his name right there. I was able to weed through it and find his name on the logbooks, or what they call muster rolls. So then I got the idea of doing a different search. What that webpage had told me was that there is actually documents now available specific to the Office of Strategic Services. Initially, I just put that in, and there were thousands of documents that came up, so I decided to refine the research by putting Office of Strategic Service Lloyd Elwin Wirtz, which would be my grandfather's name, and lo and behold, documents popped up. These two were muster rolls, and I tried to scroll through them, but they're thousands of pages long, and the documents are not very clear. But at least according to the search engine, it's stating that my grandfather was, more or less, on the tally sheets at some point, and that these documents were, in some way, associated with the Operation for Strategic Services. Interesting. Now, this isn't definitive proof. I don't know how you definitively prove anything, especially when a person's passed away. But it is curious, right, to say the least. And when you take that and line it up with all the things that Waugh said, the stories my grandfather said, and how they were themselves curious, and how all these things seem to line up, it seems a little bit more than coincidental. Just as a sidebar, one of the other things I noticed about these documents was that if you look at the ones that I showed you initially, if you rewind the video and look at it, they typically had titles to them, like amphibious training in Virginia, and it gave you like a date of these muster rolls that they would keep these track of who was there. When I get to the portion of the section of them when I looked under OSS, none of them have titles. They're just dates, which is super random. But again, that fits with the secrecy of these operations. So at this point, it's my theory, unprovable, but that my grandpa, our grandpa, if you're out there for all the cousins and things, was one of the early members of the OSS. He was also one of the first underwater demolition trainees, because he was part of, if you see that slide, the first group of trainees to ever do that. So he would have been one of the first SEALs had he not been selected or removed to what I believe to be a higher level operative in the OSS. Can't prove it, but it's definitely interesting. Hopefully you enjoyed that.